Hello, everyone. Samuel Yigzaw is a software engineer specializing in artificial intelligence and computer vision. He holds a master's degree in electrical and computer engineering from the University of Waterloo. Samuel became interested in economics about 3 years ago when he discovered Georgism. This is his second presentation on the topic. Welcome, Samuel.
Thank you for having me. And can't wait to start the presentation. I'll share my screen right now. Basically, I started the last presentation, wanted to get through the entire thing, but it was too long, and so I had to essentially cut it in two. The first part that I presented was on Henry George and Georgism in general, and on how it solves much of the issues of economic inequality through looking at how we can tax land. The second presentation is going to be focusing on another economist's work, Silvio Gesell, and his reforms on, or his theories and proposed reforms on uh, currency and money and how they ought to be. So actually, this is a bit of a departure from Georgism, even though Silvio Gesell was himself very inspired by George and would presume consider himself a Georgist. Uh, I would consider his work to be an extension of Georgism and like moving beyond and adding to Georgism. So with that, I want to remind you guys what the prevailing underlying philosophy of this whole presentation is. It's a quote that comes from the Silvio Gesell Institute. Basically, if you receive income without creating wealth, someone else is creating wealth without receiving income. So anytime you see somebody earning income without doing any actual work or creating any actual um, produce, well then the income that they've received and the produce that they can purchase from that has come from someone else who has not earned the corresponding produce for that. So that right there and then you can see is economic inequality in action. I started the last presentation by talking about some bandages that we incorporate into society that basically are meant to protect us from the effects of the detriments of our economic system. Um, they are merely bandages and they do not solve the underlying problems. Um, so a lot of these were kind of resolved in the last presentation with like the housing side of things, um, where if you incorporate, a land value tax and you ensure that the land is appropriately like taxed and and allowed to be put to proper use, then a lot of these housing bandages will no longer be required. And we can say a similar thing with these employment bandages as well when we fix money. A lot of them are interchangeable, so some of the land reforms will help employment and some of the money reforms will help housing as well. But in general, that's kind of how things are. So now I want to talk about the money side of things. To start off, just want to start off very, very basically from the very beginning. What even is money? What is the purpose of money? So I would start off actually with society. Humans are social creatures. The reason why we are social creatures is because when we socialize, when we get together and form societies, we are able to do what's called dividing labor or uh, essentially specializing. Somebody's going to be a farmer, somebody's going to be a fisherman, somebody's going to be a carpenter, somebody's going to be a stonemason. These people are able to specialize in their tasks and be more productive and more efficient with their individual tasks than any of them could have been if they were all generalists and all kind of homesteading and working on all, various different tasks on their own. By specializing, they're able to be professionals and are able to create much more abundance. Adam Smith talked about this in his pin factory analogy. So basically, how many pins can a person make in a day if they were just working by themselves? It's a very small amount, right? You have no ability to like you have no specialization in the trade, so you're just making pins. Whereas if you had, let's say, five people working on the task, one person specializes in, creating long, thin, strong rods. Another person specializes in putting a point on the pin, or another person specializes in maybe twisting the rod. People have different specializations. They're all of a sudden able to be much more efficient in their tasks and produce pins at orders of magnitude more than all of them would have been able to produce working individually. So that's why humans are able to, form societies and come together. The deeper they form societies, and the larger their societies, the more deeply they are able to specialize. And the more deeply that they're able to specialize, the more efficient their produces will become, and therefore the more profit they will be able to create for society. So specialization is a net good for society. So because specialization is beneficial for society and for societal, prosperity, we can consider it as a part of the commons. It's part of the common good, the ability to specialize. So as a society, we need to ensure that we are protecting the ability to specialize. But specialization has a problem. If you're just a stonemason and all you do is make, uh, bricks of stone, you don't have any food, you don't have any wood, you don't have any clothing. How are you able to get all of these other things that you need? Specialization is not enough. You need to be able to trade what you have. So trade the uh, is the thing that we need in order to make specialization a viable strategy. So because specialization is a common good, the ability to trade is also a common good. So trading now is something that we can consider as part of the commons, the ability to trade. Trading itself also comes with a issue. As you can see in this image here, one person has a fish and one person has a leg of beef or some kind of meat. And they want what the other person has, and so they come together and they trade. Well, this is quite the coincidence, right? The person who has fish just so happened to want beef, and the person who has beef just so happens to want fish. And at just the exact amount that is, equal value. And so they come together and trade. But this kind of coincidence rarely happens. Most often, people who have a certain thing that they want to give up will find it very hard to find another person who has that exact same thing that they in demand. And also, the opposite way for the trade as well. So this is called the coincidence of wants problem. It's very hard to find that opposite person to trade with. And so what you need the ability to trade with other people without exactly having what that other person specifically wants. And so what you need a common tool that basically everyone wants and that everyone can take a bit of and then spend a bit of in order to kind of facilitate trading. So this is what's called a medium of exchange. It's a medium which allows you to exchange goods and services. And this is essentially what money is. So trade is required for specialization, and specialization is common good. Therefore, trade is a common good. And money is required for trade. And so now we can say that money is a common good. Money, or the system of our money, is a part of the commons and needs to be treated in such a way that it in no way hinders what we're using it for, which is trading. And the point of this presentation is essentially that the current system of money that we have right now has a feature built into it which does hinder our ability to trade. And that feature is interest. So what is uh, interest? I want to talk about four main questions with it. And basically, I want to kind of break it down a bit. So one question, where does interest originate from? Is interest natural? You might assume that it is. What are the effects of interest on the economy? And lastly, if we think interest is bad, how do we get rid of it? And I also want to make sure that I break down what I mean when I say interest. So interest has many different components to it. There's the risk premium. So this is basically the effect of your credit score. If you're a risky person to lend to, then the risk premium will be higher. And so the interest rate on your loans will be higher. But this is not really true interest. This is more like an insurance on the loan. This is basically, if you default on the loan, then, that insurance will kind of make up for that. So that's not what I'm talking about. Also, there are administrative costs like a service fee or a transaction fee, basically a fee for servicing the loan, for paying the bank employees for, doing all the due diligence when they're giving you the loan. And so basically that's just paying the bank for their labor. So that's not interest either. That's basically a service fee. That's not what I'm talking about either. There's also an adjustment for inflation. So, a loan will be over a certain period of time, and over that period of time, there's going to be an expected amount of inflation that occurs. And so uh, they want to account for that expected amount of inflation, and they bake it into the interest rate. But that's inflation. That's not interest. So I'm not talking about that either. What I'm talking about is pure interest, or the risk-free rate. If you want to talk about essentially the interest rate that comes from central banks. So where does interest come from? This is an image of a famous miser, Ebenezer Scrooge from A Christmas Carol. So
Ah,
it kind of will let you know where I'm going with this. So there are various different theories on interest. Where does it originate from? One theory that you might hear is, the productivity theory. Basically, interest is the return on capital. So essentially, if you invest in some sort of capital, a business or a piece of machinery, that investment is going to return you money because, the business, creates profits, or the machine creates, goods or whatever. And so that creation becomes the interest. That's one theory. Um, as I'll explain further on, I believe this is not the correct theory because this is causally reversed. I believe the fact that we have interest is the reason why we're able to make profits off of investments, not the other way around. Another theory is time preference theory. Basically, this theory says that people prefer to have money today rather than money tomorrow. I'd rather have money right now instead of money a year from now. And this is also causally reversed. Basically, the reason why I want money right now instead of a year from now is because I can invest it and earn interest. It's not the other way around. So the fact that interest exists is the reason for my time preference. It's not the time preference being the reason for interest. Additionally, some might say, oh, it's riskier to accept money tomorrow instead of today. Well, again, that's considering the risk premium, which we're not talking about right now. So we're talking about, if the money is guaranteed today or guaranteed next year, what's the reason for preferring it today? Well, that's because I can make interest off of it. The abstinence theory is another theory that says essentially people deserve interest because they're foregoing their ability to use that money, right? So in order to get them to forego that ability and to hold that money somewhere else by lending it, you need to pay them. And my response to this is that yes, people are foregoing their ability to spend money, but people do that all the time. It's called saving their money. People have a certain amount of money that they're trying to spend and a certain amount of money that they don't need to spend at the moment. And the money that they don't need to spend at the moment, they have no uh, there's no need to incentivize them to hold on to that money. They're already holding on to that money. So up to a point, there's really no need to provide an incentive to have someone lend their money. It's basically a market, right? So there's a certain amount of money that is available for lending and a certain amount of money that people are in demand for from lending. So it's basically supply and demand. And if the demand for money exceeds the supply, then obviously that will create an incentive to that then you'll increase the demand on money, and then you can say that the interest rate will come from that. But until that point is reached, uh, you cannot say that all money needs to have some sort of incentive to be able to forego spending it. Another theory is the liquidity preference theory, which says that basically people prefer liquid money, liquid cash, to, let's say, bonds or stocks or any sorts of investments or lending, because investments are risky. And so you cannot guarantee that you'll be able to sell your money or sell your stocks and bonds or return your get a return on your loan back immediately, because the value of those stocks or bonds might drop and you might lose money. And so therefore, since cash is more liquid, there's a preference for cash. And so in order to forego the cash, you need some sort of return. And again, this is taking into account the risk premium, which again, we're trying to avoid taking into account that part of interest. And also, like I mentioned earlier, people only need so much liquidity. They don't need to be as liquid with all their money as, like at 100%. They can have the ability to store some of their money in savings or in bonds or in stocks, uh, and not need to spend all of that money. So that still doesn't explain it. So back to this image, Ebenezer Scrooge here. Um, that's basically the Gisellian theory of where interest comes from. It comes from hoarding. Our proclivity to hoard money over goods and services. And I will talk about where this proclivity comes from, where it originates from. But this proclivity to hoard onto money, hold on to it and not want to spend it, that's where interest comes from. So the hoardability of money, where does it come from? Basically, goods and services, no matter what kind they are, for the most part, depreciate in value. There are a few exceptions. There's like gold, maybe there's antiques, wine. But besides like a few exceptions, almost all goods and services depreciate in value over time. Ignoring inflation, we're going to talk on that in a bit. But besides inflation, money does not depreciate like goods and services does. So because of this, people want to hoard onto their money in order to essentially, because they can hold onto the money and not have it depreciate instead of trading it for goods and services, which will depreciate. So this hoardability is what's manifesting as interest. So I want to make sure that we understand what the purpose of money is for, like I talked about in the beginning of the presentation, so that we can essentially break down why interest pops up from money. So, like I said earlier, money is the tool that we have invented. It's a technology. It's not natural. It's a technology that we have invented to solve the coincidence of wants problem. So, in order to do this, we've invented this thing called money. And traditionally, money has been given various different functions by economists. One of the functions is a unit of account. So basically the ability to measure value in this money. We want to be able to say this thing is X amount of schmeckles, this thing is Y amount of schmeckles, and we can compare schmeckles um, in that. So that's what the unit of account means. Second, as I stated earlier, money is a medium of exchange. So It's a tool that we use in order to help us trade with each other. And third, another function that's been given is a store of value, which means basically money is useful in order to help us retain wealth over time, right? So you can save your money today and next year you'll have the same money and it'll be essentially a storage of wealth for you. Now, what I want to say is that these last two functions are actually contradictory to each other. So the better a store of value something is, the more hoardable it is, the more you're able to hold on to it, essentially by definition, and it's more easy to hold on to. And the more easy it is to hold on to, the more hoardable something is, the less you're going to want to spend it, the less you're going to want to trade it, especially against something that is less hoardable. So the more hoardable something is, the worse it is as a medium of exchange. And especially if you want to use this entity in order to exchange things with things that are depreciating, if your thing is not depreciating, then right there and then, that hoardability is going to make it much less favorable to trade against. And so what it really comes down to is that the entity that we are using as a medium of exchange really should not be the same entity that we are using for stores of value. These two functions are contradictory and are the cause of interest and the social inequality or the economic inequality that stems from it. So I want to talk about interest and see if it's something that is a natural phenomenon or something that arises from something else. So if we are to imagine a barter economy, basically interest would not exist by lending and borrowing in such an economy. So let's say, imagine the coincidence of one's problem is solved, or imagine you come across a coincidence. You have exactly what someone needs and someone else, uh, so let me give an example. Let's say you have a bunch of chickens. Your neighbor has a bunch of chickens, and this week your chickens have laid a lot of eggs, a very, very large amount of eggs, and your neighbor's chickens have not. And this is a common phenomenon. Sometimes your chickens lay a lot of eggs in a week. Sometimes they lay almost none in a week. So you have a large amount of eggs, and you have too many to eat in this week, and you don't know what to do with them. You know, you have no refrigerators. So what do you do with these extra eggs? You want to be able to preserve them into the future so that you can have eggs in the weeks when your chickens don't lay eggs. So how are you going to be able to do this? Well, you could lend your eggs to your neighbor because your neighbor is in dire need of eggs from not being able to have any eggs for that week. And in exchange, your neighbor agrees to lend you his eggs or to return your eggs back, new eggs, when he has an abundance of eggs and you don't. Now, this system is beneficial for both you and for your neighbor. You, the lender, and your neighbor, the borrower, because you have essentially, through your neighbor, preserved your eggs into the future. You're going to get different eggs back, but they're going to be of equal value and of equal depreciation. So they're not going to have depreciated one bit. So without a refrigerator, you have essentially preserved your eggs into the future, and that's a service for both the lender and the borrower. And because it's beneficial for both the lender and borrower, there is no need to provide an incentive to the lender in the form of an interest on that loan. The borrower doesn't need to return more eggs to the lender because the lender is already benefiting. So you can see in an economy that is derived from assets that depreciate on equal timelines, interest is no longer a feature in that economy. And you can see here, essentially, another thing that I want to get across. There is no essential difference between what's a lender and what's a saver. A saver is essentially someone who's putting their assets away into the future in order to use them again. And a lender is basically doing the exact same thing, But I guess in today's economy, there's the added connotation of, having interest be returned. But, in an economy without interest, lending and saving is essentially the same thing. Now, I want to talk about what the effects of interest are on the economy. Basically, the major effect is that interest is a barrier to entry for businesses, for all kinds of uh, enterprise. And the way that this happens is you can imagine, let's say you're a new business trying to step into a new sector of the economy. You've just opened up a new sector of the economy. You're making a certain amount of you're going to have a certain amount of expected profit from that. Let's say your expected profit is 10% per year. And let's say for simplicity's sake, the interest rate is, let's say, 5% a year. So in order to start your business, you're going to have to take out a loan, in order to start, you have startup costs, you're going to have to pay employees, you're going to have to pay for, renting a building, buying different kinds of assets, things like that. So you borrow money, it's at 5% a year when you start up the business, and you're expected to make 10% a year um, as part of the profit. So it's a viable business, okay? And you go and you do that, and everything's well and dandy. Now, someone else sees this and they say, okay, looks like a very viable sector. Someone's making 10%. I want a piece of that pie. I'm going to join in as well. So someone in joins in, starts a business, making 10% profits a year, same thing. As more and more people see this and, start businesses and enter the sector, competition starts up. They're competing both uh, for customers and for employees as well, for workers in that sector. So, customers are going to want lower and lower prices, so they're competing to lower the prices of their product. As more and more employees enter that sector, and more and more people, uh, there's more and more jobs for more and more people, the wages for that sector will rise because there's more and more jobs, there's more demand for employees in that area, in that sector. So on one end, product prices are lowering. On the other hand, labor costs are rising. So on both ends, you're getting squeezed. The profit margin is now decreasing. So instead of 10%, you're going down to 9%, 8%, 7%, 6%. Eventually, you'll reach 5% as more and more businesses come into the market. And now all of a sudden, the next person who's trying to come into the sector sees that, oh, the profit margins for the sector are less than 5%. That's lower than the interest rate. So on the one hand, either if they borrow money, they are not expected to have profits that will be able to pay off that loan. Or on the other hand, if people are looking to invest in that company, there's no reason to invest in a company whose returns are lower than what they can get in the bond market. So if you look at it as borrowing money or getting invested in, either way, the business is no longer viable. And so the sector can no longer support any more business entrants. And so what you can see here is that the interest rate, that 5% interest rate, acts as a cap on businesses trying to enter that sector. And so therefore, um, there's essentially that interest rate acts as a barrier for businesses entering that market. If the interest rate was 3% or 2% or even 0%, well, then that barrier would be lowered down to those amounts. And so what would the effect of that be? The effect of that would be even more businesses entering, more decrease in the prices of products, more increases in employee wages, and essentially the profit margin would decrease down to zero. And what's the profit margin? It's the essentially the profits that go to the shareholders of the business, right? So after all of the wages have been paid for all the workers, the extra dividends that go to the shareholders, that, which is, on average, a very steady amount if you were to like look into what you can get from S&P 500. Um, it's a very steady amount, predictable amount because it originates from essentially this rule. Um, that profit would dwindle to zero. And those dividends are, unearned income. They are the income that you receive without doing any work, right? You just put your money into some stocks and you receive money for doing nothing, essentially. That would end. And it would be a natural end through no sorts of government regulation or anything. It would just be through the effects of the market, through competition, with when you remove the ability for interest to take effect, this is uh, the natural output. So how do we get rid of interest? Now, I talked earlier about how we're going to defer the talk on inflation. So now I'm going to get into it. The current method we use to get rid of interest is actually inflation, right? So these effects of interest that I was talking about are well known, actually. And the solution, the solution that we've come up with is essentially using the mechanism of inflation to reduce the hoardability of money. So what is inflation? Inflation is essentially increasing the money supply beyond the value of goods and services in the economy. So the overall price level uh, essentially has to rise to match. And so when you increase the price level, people who are holding on to their money are losing the value in that money. And so then therefore they're incentivized to spend that money more quickly. So that's how they reduce the hoardability of money. Now, there's an issue with inflation, and that issue is basically it constitutes a transfer of wealth. So when you have any sort of contract, either between a lender, a debtor, or between an employee and an employer, and that's the major one actually. Um, the future money that is being talked about within that contract is less valuable the longer time moves on, right? So your contract essentially is less valuable as time moves on. Why? Because the overall money supply is increasing and the future value of money is decreasing. And so the agreements that are made within these contracts are essentially being deteriorated. And so, employees are finding that their agreed upon contract is worth less and less, and they're earning less and less real value over time. And it makes people mad. And so because it makes people mad and nobody likes inflation, well, then the central banks are essentially saying, okay, we were doing this inflation thing to, speed up the economy, remove interest, ensure everyone has, the ability to work and get employed and everything. But because you guys don't like inflation that much, well, we're going to raise the interest rates back up so that we can lower inflation. So it's essentially an oscillation between interest rates and inflation. We know the Federal Reserve in the US or central banks elsewhere, they control the interest rates and they say, okay, uh, there's too much unemployment, there's too much homelessness, there's too much, we're running into a recession. We need to decrease interest rates, speed the economy back up. And when they do that, okay, the economy gets faster and faster. Well, then now money is getting created through inflation, and the inflation makes it so that people are, you know, uh, their money is being worth less and less, and so people start getting mad at that, and then the central banks are forced to raise the interest rates in order to decrease the inflation. And then when that happens, okay, so now the money supply is no longer inflating, but now people are losing their jobs and the economy is slowing down. And so you can't like either way, both sides are detrimental, and the central banks are essentially trying to carve this middle path without oscillating too hard on one side or the other. But and this is essentially what we're seeing as the business cycle between recessions and high inflation. Uh, but there is a way to essentially remove the ability or the need for either inflation or interest and go a third route without going through a down either path. And that's what I want to talk about right now. So the essential prescription that Silvio Gesell comes up with to solve this issue is essentially to create a mechanism where money is able to depreciate over time in order to reduce hoardability without affecting the future value of money, which is where inflation messes up. So demurrage is a concept that comes from, I think, shipping. Basically, it's some term that relates to like the more you spend time in, holding up a port, the more money you spend, something like that. But when applied to currency, demurrage is essentially talking about a currency which itself, the dollar bills, will depreciate over time. So the longer you hold on to a $100 bill, for example, the more that $100 bill depreciates. It doesn't affect the value of future $100 bills. It doesn't affect the value of a contract that you've written with your employer. It just affects the dollar bills that you're holding on to right now or that are in your bank, you know. So those pieces of money, you're still incentivized to spend. You're still incentivized to trade them with other goods and services which also depreciate in value, right? You don't have this hoardability incentive, but you're still able to uphold contracts that are being uh, signed by both parties. So because it doesn't affect the future value of money, prices remain stable, right? Because the future value of money is not being changed at all. So because prices are remaining stable, there's no transfer of wealth from one side to the other. And then that means there's no negative effects on the overall economy. And because there's no negative effects, actually, there doesn't need to ever be any letting up of the demurrage rate. Unlike inflation, where you let up inflation in order to appease people so that their purchasing power doesn't dwindle. There's no need for that. You can go full force with demurrage without increasing interest rates. And so because of this, essentially we've created a way to appease people, make sure that they're happy with their purchasing power, they're not losing out on the value of the contracts, and also simultaneously get rid of the interest rate. We no longer need the interest rate in order to lower inflation. And so this is the best of both worlds. And this is the mechanism that Silvio Yigzaw came up with to essentially eliminate interest. This is a slide that I had originally. Kind of wanted to go more into theory on the quantity theory of money. In the interest of time, I'll hold off on it unless some people have questions, but it's here if you guys need it. So going back to the components of interest that I talked about at the very start. Again, risk premium, we're not talking about that. That is essentially just insurance on your loans. Administrative costs, those are essentially just service fees or paying for the labor of processing a loan. The other two, however, are completely gone because with this system, you no longer need inflation, right? Inflation disappears. And also interest also disappears. Pure interest from the central bank. So essentially the major components of interest are gone. And especially the pure interest part is the part that it really matters. And so then what are the effects of the economy that this is going to have? Essentially, once you get rid of interest, you remove those barriers to entry that are there for starting a business. Immediately, you increase competition between businesses for employees and also for the price of goods. So you lower the cost of products in the economy, and you raise the negotiating power of labor, essentially workers. And so because of this, the trickle-down effects of this are essentially eliminating unemployment and other things that come down to that, such as homelessness. And then on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, passive income, the ability to make money off of dividends or interest off of bonds or off of loans, that will also drop towards zero as well. And I want to make sure that we're talking about on average. All of these things are on average because again, we're not talking about the risk side of things. So if you re-add the risk side of things, Sure, you can speculate, you can gamble, but that will be a zero-sum game. So on average, you will earn zero. Um, Now you might ask, okay, if your money is depreciating, if your cash on hand is depreciating, well, how are you supposed to save your money into the future? You might want to save for retirement, you might want to save for a big purchase, this and that. How are you supposed to do that if your cash is dwindling? And I would like to go back to what I was saying earlier about how money was servicing currently these two contradictory functions of being a medium of exchange and simultaneously a store of value. So right now, what I'm trying to optimize for is for money to be a medium of exchange. It is meant to be traded, right? I think in order to store value, we don't need money in order to store value. You can store value in whatever you want, anything you want. You can store it in gold, you can store it in various different assets. What I talked about earlier, just now, of stocks and bonds, those are essentially stores of value because you put your money in a stock or bond or a mutual fund, in order to remove risk. And the average rate is going to be 0% return. So that is essentially savings, right? You can save by storing your currency when you're not needing it in a business that does need it in order for them to operate with that medium of exchange so that they're able to circulate that currency, use it however they need in order to facilitate their business. And when you need that money back, sell your stocks and you'll be able to receive that money and spend it on yourself and keep circulating the currency. It's not meant to stagnate. Currency is meant to circulate. So store your money in areas where other people can use it. Now, this is, I think, the hardest part of this whole concept, the implementations of demurrage. How are you actually going to physically depreciate the currency? And what's that going to look like? So it's been done in the past. There are various ways of doing it, and I just want to kind of go over how it's historically been done and how I would prefer to do it. So in the past, um, it's the merge has been implemented and then kind of quickly shut down by central banks because, central banks don't want uh good currencies apparently. You can make of that what you will. But when it has been tried, the implementation was using stamps. So essentially, you would have currencies that would have, a portion of the bill dedicated towards a stamp feature. And you would every month you would buy stamps and stamp one of these stamps onto the bill to essentially denote that you have paid for this bill for this month. So like the stamp, like let's say a stamp would be worth, I don't know, a certain percentage of the bill, maybe 0.5% or something like that. And so then every month you pay for that bill, and that would essentially mean that the bill is becoming less and less valuable over time unless you pay for it. And so through this mechanism, it's essentially encouraging you to give that bill up and spend it on something. And the issue with this is obviously, it's a physical process. You have to go out and buy stamps and you have to stamp them onto your bills. And you have to, every time you're buying something, count the stamps and things like that. It's kind of cumbersome. It's not really good for a fast economy. And so the method that I would prefer actually in order to implement demurrage is actually through electronic means, right? Most of our money right now is electronic, whether you're purchasing things through a credit card, from your bank, or using your phone to tap to pay or things like that. And so we already have infrastructure for electronic purchasing. We might as well be able to, implement our demurrage through those systems as well, right? We can just continuously depreciate the currency instead of, depreciating the currency in stages once a month or something like that. So it's a continuous, smooth depreciation, and you can spend your money through, digital wallets and things like that. Certain people might have an issue with that because, relying on digital currency, they might say, oh, it's too traceable, it's giving the government too much power, things like that. And I feel like that's more of an issue in politics instead of economics. But if that's an issue, again, we can use technology to solve those issues. We can go back and say, okay, let's implement a currency that is anonymous and secure, using blockchain or through some other technology. And you can audit it however you want, but we can work around those issues and make it a convenient, easy way uh, to have a currency. And the benefits are so vast, right? The removal of all economic inequality, the supercharging of your economy by vastly increasing the amount of enterprise that's available, and the purchasing power of labor and the reduced cost of goods. It's very worth it to be able to go down this route. And there are various other methods as well if you're trying to be a little bit more nuanced with things. You can timestamp the bills in order to say that, okay, this bill is X amount of months old or whatever, and so it's now worth this value. And you can have scanning apps or whatever determining the value of the bills. So that's kind of a physical process, but it's more convenient than stamps. And there's other methods that you can, other mechanisms that you can kind of um, uh, attempt to implement if you don't like either of these routes. So that's basically the end of the presentation. I just want to summarize again. Um, how do we start? Basically, we're assuming um, we want societies. We want to be able to socialize and come together. Why do we want that? It's because it allows us to produce a vast amount of goods and services beyond what we could each do individually as humans, off in the wilderness by ourselves. And so in order to support these societies and support the division of labor, we need to come together, and that benefits everyone. And in order to do that, we need to specialize. In order to specialize, we need to trade with each other. And in order to trade, we need money. Now, the money that we have has a feature called interest, and this interest hinders the trade that we're trying to do. And the reason why we have interest is because of the hoardability of money, right? Because money is hoardable, and without inflation, which again is also detrimental, it is it has the feature of not being able to depreciate in value, whereas the goods and services that we trade for it do depreciate in value. So next, interest is the source of unearned profits, or one of the sources, and it lowers competition, it contributes to wage slavery, and contributes to unemployment. Demurrage eliminates interest with no negative side effects, unlike inflation. And the overall effects are that this will lead to the removal of unearned passive income, and instead turning it into long-term savings, essentially. The same mechanism that you would use for unearned passive income turns into the mechanism that you would use for long-term savings. And lastly, there are various physical ways that I've mentioned of implementing demurrage. And that's the end of my presentation. Questions?